Guten Abend. At moments like this, I wish I had listened to my mother, who insisted that I should continue with my German language lessons. I feel grossly ashamed not to be able to speak German like she did. My apologies. I truly wish that I had listened to her. Let me tell you a couple of stories first, as an introduction. In early 2010, I became prominent in Greece. Up until then, I was living the charmed life of an academic that wrote his obscure books for 20 colleagues that would read them around the world. But then suddenly I became prominent. I became prominent because, as a former advisor of somebody who later became prime minister, I wrote an article in which I said that the Greek state was bankrupt after the 2008 collapse, and that the Greek nation was facing a very significant challenge and choice. If we made the mistake, I wrote in this article, to pretend that we were not bankrupt by getting a huge loan in order to make repayments and get it on condition from our fellow Europeans and get it on conditions that guaranteed the shrinking of our income, to pretend that you can get out of a bankruptcy through new borrowing would condemn us to 50 years of a Great Depression. And I warned the Greek Prime Minister at the time, who used to be a friend of mine and somebody that I used to advise, George Papandreou at the time, that he should not accept such a loan, that we should accept and embrace the bankruptcy, that we should renegotiate our debt, because remember, back then, the Greek state owed the German people zero. Exactly zero. To Slovak people, zero. We had no debt to states. We had debt to banks. Now, if I were to lend you €1 million without paying attention to your finances, and then you couldn't pay me back, I respectfully submit to you that half of the responsibility is mine and half of the responsibility is yours. For every responsible debtor, there is an irresponsible lender. And the notion that all debts will always be paid is catastrophic for capitalism. Think about it. If all debts were always to be repaid, then why would any banker be careful as to who he or she lends to? They would just lend to everyone. They would expect to be, bailouts to come. And that is think about it. Bankruptcy is to capitalism that which hell is to Christianity. Unpleasant, but essential. It doesn't work otherwise. So the idea that all debts will have to be repaid to the private bankers by the taxpayers of another country like Germany is abominable. You don't have to be a left-winger. You don't have to belong to Die Linke. A banker knows that. No banker expects to get all their money back. They know that some debts will not be repaid. They take some risks. So when in 2010, George Papandreou, the Greek Prime Minister, went to the European Union and said to them, sorry, we're broke. Just broke. We just can't repay our debts. We'll get into why that happened, but it was a fact. He received a 999. 999. This is a historic 9. Remember what had happened a couple of years before that in the United States of America? When Lehman Brothers, the great investment bank, went bankrupt. And Mr. Falz, the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer, went to the Treasury Department, to the Ministry of Finance, and said, we're broke. Can you help? And Hank Paulson, who was the Minister of Finance, the US Treasury Secretary, said, nope, go bankrupt. Imagine the following answer. It didn't happen, but imagine for a second the following answer. No help, no bailout, and you can't go bankrupt. We are not allowing you to go bankrupt. What? It does not compute. How is this possible? If I'm bankrupt, you don't give me a loan, and you don't allow me to default, how is this going to happen? It just doesn't happen. This is what the Greek government received, the 999. No interest rate relief, no bailout, you're not allowed to default. A few months later, of course, because it's like the laws of gravity. You can't defy them for very long. You crash. Huh? Then they gave him the bailout loan, which I had warned against. So think about it. The largest loan in human history was given by you folks to a bankrupt state on condition that the bankrupt state would reduce the income, which was not enough to pay the old loans, and from that shrinking income, it would have to pay the old loans, which the larger income couldn't pay, and the new loans, which were the largest in human history, bigger than the Marshall Plan. But of course, this was not a loan for Greece. It was a loan for Deutsche Bank. Because you know what had happened before that, don't you? About a year before, Angela Merkel went to the place where this guy is sitting, the Bundestag, and effectively secured 500 billion for the German banks after the Lehman Brothers debacle. When Wall Street was collapsing, European politicians were saying to themselves, oh, we don't have a problem. This is the Anglo-Saxons. Our banks are fine. And then they looked inside the books of the banks, like Deutsche Bank, Finanzbank, BNP Paribas, Société Générale, and they found that they were worse than Lehman Brothers. Two numbers. Lehman Brothers had a leverage ratio of 37:1. For every $1 it had borrowed 37. Do you know what Deutsche Bank was? 71 to 1. 71 to 1. So you bailed them out. 500 billion. A government which is austere, Protestant, Calvinist, whatever it is, and tightens its belt, sent 500 billion to the bankers. It was very painful for Merkel to do that because she had not understood, like no government, no politician understood what the financial sector was up to. But when Deutsche Bank went to them and said, you know what, we're going to shut our ATMs down, immediately take 500 billion. But it wasn't enough. It still is not enough. You heard what's been going on with Deutsche Bank shares recently, right? But anyway, that's another story. A year later, when the Greek state went bankrupt, suddenly they realized that those banks had lent, the same banks had lent around 400 billion to countries like Greece, Portugal, and Ireland. Another 400 billion. And if Greece could not repay that money, then it would be Ireland, there would be Portugal, and then maybe Italy and Spain. And then we would be talking about 2 trillion. Okay? So they simply thought, Merkel thought, oh my God, how do I go to the Bundesbank? And having just secured 500 billion for these people who were making humongous profits for years, and now they're suddenly bankrupt, and they want us to bail them out a second time. So they decided to bail them out anyway, but to call it solidarity with Greece. Do you know what percentage of the money that Greece got from the first bailout, the second bailout, and the third bailout is going to the Greek state? 6%. The rest went all to the banks. So it was a bailout for the banks. Now, I don't have a problem as an economist bailing out the banks, because the banks are not just any businesses. If the banks shut down tomorrow, and we know what happened in Greece when they shut down, the whole economy grinds to a halt. So there is an argument for bailing out banks. There's no argument for bailing out bankers and letting them control the banks that they crashed against the wall with taxpayers' money, and no control over what they do with this taxpayers' money. Now, Greece should not be important. To us Greeks, it should. To you, it shouldn't be. Let me put it slightly differently. We were discussing this earlier in some interview. Suppose that in 1999, a certain gentleman called Kostas Simitis, who used to be a professor here in Germany of law, once upon a time, who happened to be the Prime Minister of Greece at the time, 1999, imagine that he had an epiphany in his sleep. Imagine that God and his angels appeared in his mind and said, don't get into the Eurozone. Well, you would not be discussing Greece now. You would be discussing Greece as much as you are discussing Bulgaria. It would have its drachma, it would be more sluggish during the period 2000-2008 in its growth. It wouldn't have 5% growth. It would have 1% growth. And then after 2008, it would go down a little bit, like Bulgaria did, but there would be no crash. And it would be recovering now. So imagine he had done that. Well, do you think that the euro crisis would not have happened? Of course it would have happened. This is a systemic crisis. It would have happened somewhere else. Greece was like the little canary in the cage that the miners used down the mines. They had them there in the cage in case there was methane that escaped from the mine shaft as they were drilling, so that the canary would die first. They would see it and would think, oh my God, there's a problem here, let's evacuate before we die. So Greece is the canary that died first. It did not cause the crisis. It is not capable of causing the crisis. It's 2% of the EU economy, of the Eurozone economy. Let me put it slightly different again. Imagine that the great state of Delaware in America, it's tiny. Have you heard of the state of Delaware? Tiny little insignificant thing. Nice place, but insignificant. If the state of Delaware had an economic crisis, which was in the news for 10 years, and all America was saying that the United States of America, the dollar zone, is being blackmailed by Delaware. Delaware is about to destroy the dollar zone. Respectfully, again, let me tell you that if that were the case, this would be a problem for the United States, not for Delaware. It would indicate that there's something wrong with the architecture of the United States of America. If Delaware, a pipsqueak little Delaware, could bring down the whole of America, there would be something wrong with America. Okay? This insistence on talking about Greece, the failures of the Greek state. Now, nobody needs to lecture me on the failures of the Greek state. I'm a Greek. I suffer the Greek state since birth. I even had to serve it for a few months as a finance minister. By the way, there's nothing better for a recovering finance minister than to be in a university environment again. So thank you for this invitation. Like a recovering alcoholic, you know. Now the question is, why does Europe, all of Europe, and I'm not blaming Germany, France, Greece, all of us, all of our elites, our ruling classes of governments, why are they refusing to have the discussion that we should be having? Why are we constantly talking about Greek debt? Who cares about Greek debt? It is just a symptom. It's like going to a doctor, knock on wood, and suffering from cancer, and you're in pain. And the doctor says to you, oh, you're suffering from a pain crisis. It's true. You're in pain. But this is a useless diagnosis. Pain is a symptom of the cancer. Greek debt is a symptom of the architecture of the Eurozone. Let me give you another brief story. 2011, after the crisis had erupted, I remember I was flying from Frankfurt to New York, going to a conference. And I was sitting next to a very nice person. His name was Franz, I remember, German. And you know how it is, these long flights, they take 10 hours. After a while, you start talking because you're so bored. So he started telling his story. And he said he was a recovering banker, former banker, Deutsche Bank. Oops, shouldn't have said which bank. Anyway, France, I'm sure there were quite a few Frances back then. So he was telling me his story. And I asked him, why did you resign? He said, oh, you have no idea. I lived a charmed life up until the creation of the euro. And a nightmare after the euro was created. I didn't understand what he meant. He's a banker, after all. Why was he living a nightmare after the euro was created? He said, listen, up until 2000, actually 1998, because the euro was almost complete by 1998. We saw the paper in 2000, but it was more or less all locked in by 1998. He said, up until 1998, from the early 80s when I started my career, I was the master of the universe. I would fly to Athens, I would fly to Madrid, I would fly to Paris to meet clients, corporations, municipalities, state-owned enterprises, governments, who wanted money from me, from Deutsche Bank. Right? And I would be treated like a king, like royalty. They would take me to the opera. They would take me to the best restaurants. They would try to smooth talk me. They would give me all their business plans and data, and they would be very reverential and look at me as if I was the person from which life depended. And then I would go back to Frankfurt, and I would look at this data for about a week, study them, you know, the different requests for funding. Eventually, I would decide who would get money and who wouldn't. It was great. And then the euro happened. Life wasn't worth living. Suddenly, headquarters was giving me quotas. You have to lend 2 billion this week. Suddenly, I was running around like a headless chicken. I was going from one capital to the other, begging them to take our money. I was bribing them to take our money. And they treated me with contempt. They had the power suddenly. All those people who were responsible for the corruption in Greece, in Italy, I had to push money down their throat. And if I didn't, my job was on the line, my bonuses were reduced. If I didn't lend, I didn't care about their creditworthiness. I didn't care about their business plan. I wanted them to take the money. And I resigned because I had a stroke doing this. Now, question, why did this happen? What was the change? You see, all these questions are related to the same issue. What did we do when we created the euro? Why did we do it? And why are we failing to respond rationally and humanely after we made that mess? As you may have noticed, in the last year, I was in the Eurogroup as Greece's Minister of Finance. I can assure you, whether you agree with me or not, whether you like me or not, whether you like the fact I don't wear a tie or not, all this lifestyle rubbish, whether it's okay that I ride the Japanese motorcycle, not the BMW. If you were with me, if you were a fly, you know, sitting on my shoulder and we were watching it, you too would think of the words of a famous quantum mechanics physicist, Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr, in his autobiography, wrote a story. There were many little stories. It's a beautiful book. Read it. He recounts that a day when another fellow physicist, great physicist, came to visit him in Norway in his summer house. And his friend, the other physicist, walks in and sees above the gate a horseshoe pinned on the wall. And turns to Niels Bohr and said, Niels, I never expected you to believe in this superstition. What? Is this fending off evil spirits or what? And Niels Bohr said, oh, of course I don't believe in it, but my housekeeper tells me that it works even if you don't believe in it. This is the finance ministers of the Eurozone. They know that the policies they're imposing on Greece, on Germany, do not work. But they still hope that they will believe, that they will work, even if they don't believe in it. Another little story. We can go into the analysis further with the discussions, but I don't want to give a fully academic lecture now. You don't deserve this. First meeting with top-notch person in the International Monetary Fund. I won't mention names. The first thing she said to me, oops, you didn't get that. Come on, wake up. The first thing she said to me, IMF, International Monetary Fund, come on, Dieter, tell them, was, Yanis, after I explained that we were elected to go to them with an open mind and ask them for a genuine renegotiation of a program that failed most spectacularly. No economic adjustment program has failed as much as the Greek one had. 30% of national income in euros, in nominal terms, was lost. 30%. That is worse than the Great Depression. Unemployment went up from 8 to 28%. Youth unemployment climbed from 31 to 67%. Now, how much more can you fail than that? How much more can you fail than that? And so I was saying to them, can we sit down with an open mind and renegotiate this program? It's failed. And she said to me, Yanis, I know this program cannot work. Can I say this once more? Yanis, I know this program cannot work. Not that it will not work, cannot work. But we are committed to it. And your credibility depends on accepting it. I said, what? The head of the International Monetary Fund, which is a technical organization, tells me that my debt is unsustainable, but I have to borrow more money. Now that's a criminal act. No bankrupt entity should have the right to borrow more money and has the right not to be forced to borrow more money. Do you know why I'm not the finance minister of Greece today? Because I refused to sign on a new loan agreement that committed Greece to getting another 85 billion from you, because I knew we couldn't repay it. And I said, you know, what's my moral duty as a finance minister? Not to take more money if I know I cannot repay it. And I can't even repay the existing debt. Now, friends, let me assure you, if I was willing to do as the lady said to me, to accept a program which she said cannot work, do you know how it would be portrayed in the media, in Süddeutsche Zeitung, in ZDF, how would it be portrayed as a reformed leftist who learned how to be responsible and who accepted the onus of reforming Greece? That's how I would be based in the light of acceptance. It's because I said no to another loan from you, which is bad for you and bad for us. The fact that we dared say no to the Troika that had failed, that we dare say no to a program which the Troika tells us behind closed doors that it can't work, that we're being discussed in terms of what clothes we wear and whether we have a demonic smile or not. Now, if I were you, I would be thinking to myself, assume this person is right. We still don't understand why this is happening. If I'm saying what I'm saying to you is right, do you know what this means? It means that Wolfgang Schäuble does not care about getting your money back. Because if you do, then you don't give more loans to a bankrupt entity. You don't. And he doesn't care about getting your money back. How do I know? The beauty of those 5-6 months in power, or not in power, without any power, in government. The beauty of that was that for the first time in my life, I'm an academic theorist. I didn't have to theorize. He told me. When I said to him when was it? Sometime around the 25th of June, I said to him, Wolfgang, do you think that if I sign that, there is any chance that I can repay these loans? He said, no. And then I asked him, so why you're doing this? And the answer, I've already published it in Die Zeit sometime in the summer, so I'm not revealing something that I haven't said before, was because I want the Troika in Paris. How can I let you off the hook? When Europe is coming to the point of crushing one proud nation in order to control the national budget of another, you know there's a problem. And this problem is not a problem of imperialism, Dieter. It's a problem of a rotten European Union, because this policy is what is now causing huge problems in Germany. Your pension funds in this country are going bankrupt because of negative interest rates. Why do we have negative interest rates in Germany? We have negative interest rates in Germany because the Eurozone is collapsing. Draghi has to pump out 65 billion a month in order to keep the euro afloat. He's forced by the charter of the central bank, which was written by the Bundesbank 20 years ago, to buy more bunds than he buys Spanish debt. That pushes down the interest rates of bunds below zero, and the pension funds in this country are suffering. And you have this remarkably irrational situation. The Germans are a rational nation. Kant was born here. Hegel was born here. Marx was born here. We have the greatest tradition of rational thought coming from this country. And yet you have a situation where today in Germany you have the lowest level of investment since the war, when interest rates are negative. Now, how clever is this? Isn't this a failure? I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that this is the other side of the Greek Depression. The Greek Depression and the fact that your infrastructure in this country is crumbling, and the government that could be effectively be paid by the investors to invest. That's what negative interest rates means. You're being paid by the people who lend you money to invest in the Hamburg port, on hospitals, on things that are suffering in Germany today because of underinvestment. It's choosing not to do this. So there are no winners in this. You know, my great disagreement with many comrades in France, in Italy, I've been saying for 6 years, stop this business of blaming Germany. Just stop it. This process of turning one nation against the other is part of the malaise, is part of the problem. Nobody benefits from this. There are individuals that benefit. There are bankers that benefit. There are politicians who think that, you know, they hang on to their ministry or to the chancellery a bit longer. But no nation benefits. The German nation suffers just as much as all other nations. I've been saying this for 6 years. I have been going from one meeting to another in Greece, warning my fellow Greeks not to turn racist, never to start a sentence with the words, the Germans. And I keep saying, I'm trying to use humor. I say, there is no such thing as the Germans. There are many Germans. I mean, I know that most of the people I loathe are Greeks. As Marx used to say, we're not all brothers. I hate a lot of people. Remember his argument against starting the Communist Manifesto with brothers unite? No, there are many people I don't want to be brothers with. I can assure you there are many Greeks I don't want to be brothers with. I can give you a long list. Okay? There is so much diversity within our nations that we have far more in common as Germans and Greeks than we have with other Greeks, with other Germans. And it's about time we start thinking in terms of we Europeans and identify the causes for this disintegration, which is threatening us with a postmodern version of the 1930s. And I don't mean that in the abstract. I mean this concretely. So let's go to the 1930s for a moment. Why did we have the Great Depression and the destruction of Europe in the hands of the fascists and the Nazis? And all those liberal bourgeois idiots who thought that they can use the Nazis, like Hindenburg, and control them. Like Frankenstein, who thought he could control the creature that he created and was murdered by it. Yeah? What happened then? Allow me now to wear my academic hat of an economist just for a few minutes. If I bore you, throw something at me. I will respond positively. When you bind together different economies by means of a common currency, whether it's the euro or the gold standard or a peg, you just bind together, you create a fixed exchange rate regime between different economies. You are asking for trouble. Unless you put into the system the shock absorbers which are necessary and the institutions that are necessary to stabilize it. In the 1920s, we restored, after the First World War and the shameful Versailles Treaty, we restored the gold standard. Effectively, all the currencies became one. Of course, the French and the Americans had different notes in their pockets, but the exchange rate was fixed. And it was all fixed to the value of gold, to a quantity of gold. Yeah? Now, What do I mean by different, disparate economies? Every economy is heterogeneous. Germany is heterogeneous. You have areas of Germany that are in surplus with other areas of Germany which are in deficit to the surplus ones. So Eastern Germany has a tendency to be in deficit in relation to the area around Stuttgart, around Frankfurt. It happens in every country, in every economic union. In Britain, Yorkshire will always be in deficit to the London area. In America, Arizona will always be in deficit to California. But when you bind together these asymmetric areas, you've got to take into consideration that the reason why some parts are in surplus and some parts are in deficit has to do with different degrees of oligopoly. So, if you have a country like Germany, which has a very strong industrial sector with very powerful economies of scale, by definition, that economy is going to have a preponderance of corporations that have the capacity to set prices with significant differences between prices and marginal costs. And when you have this kind of market power, this is first-year economics, it's not even Marxist economics, it's standard economics. When you've got this kind of bargaining power over consumers, this means that if there is a reduction in demand, what tends to happen is output adjusts, price doesn't. And that means employment is cut during the bad times. When this kind of economy is bonded together with an economy like Portugal, like Greece, like Spain, where you've got lots of small companies, fewer people working in there, no economies of scale, producing non-tradable goods, goods that mostly cannot be exported to Germany, like haircuts and paellas. Huh? By the time they come to Germany, they are stale. What happens when you do this? Well, let me tell you what happens. A massive flow of money. A wave, a tsunami of money goes from the surplus country to the deficit country. You know why? Because when you've got an industrial sector which has monopoly power and the capacity to produce things that other countries cannot produce, like cars. You know, I was trying to make the point to students, to other finance ministers, that however much you reduce wages in Greece, Greek cars will not compete with German cars because they don't exist. Let's think about it. It's an important point. So this idea about competitiveness, it has to be taken with a pinch of salt. Yeah? So when you bind them together, what tends to happen is this. The moment a German banker believes that this common currency or fixed exchange rate is there to stay, the moment they think that, they think, I better lend some money to the Greeks. Why? When you have a net export regime, when you have a surplus of trade with a country like Greece, by definition, at the very same time, you have a net flow of money from Greece to Germany. Every time you sell a Volkswagen to Greece, and there's nothing equivalent being sold to Germany from Greece, 20,000 euros go from Greece to Frankfurt, and they go in a bank account. Now, this means that the greater your exports, your net exports from the surplus country to the deficit country, the greater the glut of money in Frankfurt. Do you know what bankers hate the most? Money that they are not lending. So they need to lend it. They can't lend it all to Germany. Why? To Germans. Because the Germans don't want it. The Germans do not have that much of a need for it. Interest rates, therefore, fall very low in Germany because there is a surplus of savings, of money. So the Frankfurt banker, Franz, in my story, is forced to find ways of lending it to the Greeks, to the Portuguese, where there is a dearth of money because all the money has come to Germany to buy for the Volkswagens. This is just arithmetic. It's just, there's no politics in what I'm telling you. This is pure geometry, arithmetic. Okay? My deficit to you is your surplus to me. That's it. You cannot at the same time be proud of your surplus to me and castigate me that I have a deficit. You know, not even a 5-year-old would do that. So, before the euro, Finanzbank and Deutsche Bank were worried about giving too much money to the Greeks or to the Portuguese because they feared that the escudo, the drachma, would devalue, and then those people that got money in Deutschmark would not be able to repay them in Deutschmark. But the moment they're told, oh, they have the Deutschmark, it's called the euro, then they think, okay, fine. Then they go to Greece and they say, okay, look at these people, they don't have debt at a personal level. You know, do you know what the greatest asset Greece brought into the European Union, what it was? We had no debt. It now sounds very strange, doesn't it? But this was the greatest asset. As a population, we had zero private debt. When I was growing up, the idea that you would have a debt from the bank was abhorrent. My mother and father never had a credit card, never. They considered the credit card to be an instrument of Mephistopheles. They never had a mortgage. They worked for 20 years, they put money aside, and they bought a house. And maybe they borrowed some money from their brother or from their sister. That's it. No financialization whatsoever. So Deutsche Bank goes to Greece and says, look at all these houses. They have no mortgage on them. Let's lend them money and use them as collateral. This is what the periphery brought to the party, to the Eurozone party. Collateral in the form of means by which to take the glut from the Frankfurt banks and give it to the periphery. And then what happens is this. This tsunami of capital comes in, which is exactly what happened in the 1920s with the gold standard. This tsunami of capital goes from the surplus to the deficit countries. By going into a place which is not competitive because you've got small firms that are producing paellas and Greek salads and not Volkswagens, what happens is it's much easier for this money to find its way into buying another house, buying another imported Volkswagen, building a motorway in order to satisfy your local corrupt developers. Yeah? And that creates a semblance of growth. People have more money, they spend more money, they buy a new Porsche. Yeah, they do. We had more Porsche Cayennes in Greece than you had in Germany. Seriously. No, this is a fact. Not per 1,000 inhabitants, in absolute terms. You couldn't go anywhere in Athens. There were Porsche Cayennes everywhere. We had a serious traffic jam problem because of the Porsche Cayennes in Kolonaki, in the la-di-da part of Athens. Yeah? I may be joking a bit, but it's true. Okay? And so this, between 1999 and 2008, when the whole financial disaster took place, Greece was growing at 5%, you were growing at 1.1% because of all this debt-fueled Ponzi scheme. People like me were out on the streets demonstrating against this regime. Okay? And then, of course, what happens is that the bubble bursts, like it did in 1929, beginning from Wall Street. Immediately, the common currency of the era, the gold standard, started collapsing, and very soon, the peoples of Europe were turned against each other and against themselves, and fascists were on the rise. Our generation's 1929 took place in 2008. What happened immediately after that? Wall Street collapse. The common currency of that era, of our era, started fragmenting the euro, and very soon the Greeks hated the Germans, and the Germans hated the Greeks, and everybody hated the French. Yeah? And we are disintegrating. This is why I'm saying that this is a systemic problem. We have created the gold standard in the middle of Europe. The reason why we did it was just to look at it historically a little bit. You see, there is a very important question that I think, especially the younger members of the audience, students of politics, of economics, and sociology, you should ask yourselves this question. The United States of America is a highly imperfect country. Highly imperfect. No? It leaves much to be desired. Yet, every time they had a crisis, a financial crisis, in the 19th century, in 1909, in 1911, in 1929, in the 1960s, they came closer together. They consolidated. They created new institutions that worked, like the Federal Reserve, which was a result of a financial sector collapse in the beginning of the 20th century, like the New Deal by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which created the institutions, the FDIC, that in 2008 saved the banks without making the state of Nevada pay for the banks of Nevada, unlike what we did here in Europe. So the question that you should be asking yourselves is, why is America consolidating, however imperfectly, every time there's a crisis, they get closer together and they become more resilient to the crisis, and we are failing so miserably? Now, if somebody from Brussels was here, or Schäuble, or from Frankfurt, they would say, oh, but that is not true, Yanis, you're lying again. We have consolidated. We have created new institutions, a banking union. We've created the European Stability Mechanism, things that we had not done before. Are you serious? There's no banking union. We created a banking union in name so as not to have it in practice. Do you know what a banking union means? That if I were to donate €1 million to you, that you wouldn't care whether it's in a Greek bank account, a Portuguese bank account, or a German bank account. Well, if you didn't care about that, you would be a fool. Because €1 million is not worth the same across the union. Why? Because the chances of being haircut differ depending on the solvency of the state. We don't have a banking union. We have a common supervision of banks, which is terrible because you're putting ECB officials in a terrible situation where they have to lie. Imagine for a moment that you got a job with the ECB to go and supervise a Portuguese bank today. Forget Greece for a moment, Portuguese bank. You go there, you look at the asset books. You know, if you do your job properly, as you should, as a diligent European official, you look at it, it's bankrupt. You can't say it. You can't publish this. You cannot go to the ECB and say, my recommendation is that this bank is bankrupt. Why? Because if you do, then suddenly Portugal will collapse. Why will it collapse? Because if that bank is bankrupt, firstly, the first thing that will happen is that the savers, those who have saved more than €100,000 in that bank, will lose their money. Because the state of Portugal, unlike the state of the Netherlands or the federal state here, doesn't have the money to save that bank. And nobody else can, because we don't have a banking union. We don't have a common deposit insurance system. And Wolfgang Schäuble is adamant. It will never happen while I live, I heard him say. Yeah? So we don't have a banking union, but we call it a banking union. This is George Orwell. Remember 1984, doublespeak? Or Goebbels? You take something that means X and you say that it means not X. The European Stability Mechanism. We should really have called it the European Instability Mechanism. This is a fund that supposedly lends to bankrupt governments. Well, the moment a government takes money from that fund, it has to accept to submit itself to the Troika, to lose all sovereignty, like we've lost sovereignty. Immediately that government falls. Who's going to use it? No one. This is why it's not being used. That's why Mario Draghi had to print all these euros every month, and therefore create the problems in the pension funds here in Germany. So we have not been consolidating. We do a lot of window dressing. We're excellent at producing euphemisms. We produce nice acronyms, ESM, EFSF, okay, banking union. It's all smoke and mirrors. There's no consolidation. There is more fragmentation now in the Eurozone economically, socially, than we've ever had. And the reason, of course, for this is because we have no democracy. None. I was saying before to some good folks with whom I was talking that I object to the term democratic deficit for the European Union. It doesn't make sense to say the European Union has a democratic deficit. It's like being on the moon, taking your helmet off and thinking, oh, there is an oxygen deficit. There is no oxygen deficit. There is no oxygen. Now, why is that? Why is there no democracy oxygen in Brussels or in Frankfurt? Why are we moving in the opposite direction? Instead of consolidating and creating common institutions like the Americans did, why are we moving in the other direction? Allow me to put forward a proposition to you and then close so that we can begin the conversation, which will be more interesting than what I'm saying now. Think about the state, the federal republic Think of the federal government in the United States, the government of Britain. These are states that evolved as a result of class conflict. Let's talk about Britain, which is a bit further away so that we don't get too emotional about our own countries, Germany, Greece, and so on. In Britain, everything began with the Magna Carta. What was the Magna Carta? It was an arrangement, a charter for masters. The barons were sick and tired of the king looting their loot and taking their slaves. So they had an agreement with the king that he would let them do whatever they want. And they would give him some tribute, and they would support him in his wars, but there would be a charter for masters, a charter for... And then you bring in the traders, the merchants, with commodification. They started wanting political recognition. So you had the palace, you had the landed gentry, the barons, then you had the merchants, the capitalists, the commercial people. Then you had the proletariat, which came into being in the 18th century. They had their trades unions. So the state in Britain and the constitution of Britain emerged as a result of an evolutionary process through class conflict. And that's how liberal democracy was born. Because in the end, the best way of balancing out and equilibrating this conflictual and conflicted society was through representative democracy. That's not how the European Union was created. The European Union began life, let me remind you, as the European Community of Coal and Steel. It started like OPEC, like a cartel. The idea was to fix prices of major industrial commodities so there would be no competition between French, Dutch, German, Northern Italian conglomerates. And to do this, they needed two things. They needed a common administration, like OPEC has an administration, to administer the fixing of prices. They called it the European Commission, and they put it in Brussels. And the deal was, remember, General de Gaulle, President de Gaulle of France, Germany is the horse that draws the carriage, and we, the French, are the drivers. So that was a bit of the accommodation, yeah? A terrible accommodation for Germany and for France, because France still has this view that it is driving the carriage. It's not. It's pathetic. And let me put to you my very simple hypothesis to you, my simple explanation. A cartel administration does not evolve into a democracy. It hates democracy. It uses democracy as a fig leaf in order to legitimize itself. But there is a deep contempt for you in Brussels. The idea, you see, Süddeutsche Zeitung was right, in a sense. No, less. I've got it here. Oops. No, I don't. Yes, I do. The Brussels, Süddeutsche Zeitung, when they said, oh, they attacked my argument that we should put demos back into democracy. This is the Brussels line. When we announced on the 27th of June in the Eurogroup, I announced that we were going to put the ultimatum that was given to me, the ultimatum by the Troika, to the Greek people to decide whether they wanted or not. I was admonished by almost every minister in there. Do you know what their argument was? How dare you ask common people for their views on such complicated matters? I said, it's called democracy. Democracy is a system democracy is a system where everybody gets a vote independently of how rich or poor, clever or stupid, rich in their faculties or aesthetic, or poor they are. So you see, it was clear, I mean, they were admitting it fully, that I must be an idiot to believe in the rhetoric. We use this rhetoric to keep the masses quiet. But we don't believe it in ourselves, that they should have the right to make these decisions. So you see, there is a fundamental problem here. We have a Europe where national governments have no power. You may be in government, even in Berlin. You don't have much power. This is too large a beast, the single market of Europe, to be able, even as Schäuble, to control it. And we have a European Union that has no democracy, where decisions are being made there by people that you've never heard of, that you never elected, and who are never accountable to you. This is why Europe still has 12% unemployment, whereas America doesn't. Because if America continued to have 12% unemployment after 2008, I can assure you the Congress would have gotten rid of every bureaucrat in the Federal Reserve, of the president, of the government, of everyone. We don't have this capacity. This is why we began this process a few days ago, in the heart of the most significant democracy in Europe, in Berlin, with one simple idea. If we cannot solve this by creating a party and asking for votes in our nation state, because then we get elected at best, and then we find ourselves in government but not in power. If we can't solve things on this basis, if the flimsy alliances between political parties at the level of the European Parliament, which is not, of course, a parliament, it's a joke, I'm sorry for this, but it is. It's a parliament that cannot legislate. What are we on about? Have we gone mad? We've created a parliament that cannot legislate. Only the European Union could do that. The rest of the world are laughing at us. Do you realize that? When we have a Eurogroup that makes all the decisions without even minutes being taken. So citizens will never, even through 300 years, be able to find out what Schäuble said on their behalf, or what I said on their behalf. But they will know what I said because I'm putting it out there. But that's, you know, that's the reason why I'm being laughed at and demonized. Look, we have a lot to do. It's about time we stop thinking in terms of us and them, of Germans and Greeks, and that we get together and have the conversation about the systemic crisis that our rulers have refused to treat systematically. And let me just finish with a joke in order to lighten things up, because I'm afraid things are not good. Diem is all about providing a last chance to Europe to get together. Am I optimistic? No. I have no evidence that this is going to work. We're moving towards a postmodern 1930s. But I don't think that I have the right to leave it there, personally. I'm an activist optimist, a faithful, atheistic optimist. I choose optimism without any evidence. Hopefully, if enough of us will do that, then there will be the evidence that it was a good idea. But so as not to leave you with doom and gloom, let me just finish with a joke. It's an instructive joke, even though it is historically not correct. Do you know why we created the Eurozone? It's because the French feared the Germans. The Greeks wanted to escape the Ottomans and the Turks. The Irish wanted to escape the British. The Portuguese didn't want to have much to do with Spain. The Spanish wanted to be French. The Italians wanted to be German. The Dutch had become German. The Belgians wanted to be both Dutch and French under the Deutschmark. And finally, the Germans feared the Germans. Well, let's hope that the Germans stop fearing the Germans, that fear is taken out of the equation, hope replaces it, as well as the determination that we should democratize Europe. Thank you.